Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Reed, and I'm the Chief Scientist for Renewable Fuels and Energy Storage and the Advanced Power and Energy Program at the University of California, Irvine. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to present to you here this afternoon, and I'd like to thank the conference organizers for the invitation and for their hard work in putting this conference together. I'd also like to thank the California Energy Commission for their sponsorship of the work that we'll be discussing here today. Specifically, I'll be presenting a summary of the analysis and results from a project we recently completed, assessing the conditions necessary to achieve a self-sustaining renewable hydrogen sector in California.
So to provide a little bit of context, first, we all know that we're facing daunting challenges to address decarbonization and air emissions, and California has strong mandates to address both. The state is embracing an aggressive electrification strategy founded on our abundant wind and solar resources as a primary strategy. However, there are some applications that are difficult to address with simple electrification, meaning renewable power plus batteries. These would include applications requiring storable, energy-dense energy carriers to support applications that need things like rapid fueling and heavy payload. So this would be some of the heavier duty transportation applications. We need solutions for thermal loads for certain chemical processes. And we have growing challenges of renewable intermittency on the electric grid, all of which can be addressed in part through hydrogen. A growing number of nations and regions are adopting decarbonization strategies that explicitly include hydrogen as one of the foundations. There are many of these, but they typically land on a fraction of primary energy of around 20% being served by hydrogen, plus or minus. So you can see on the right here, this depicts the future vision of a decarbonized society developed by some 20-odd academic researchers. And you can see that this vision of the future reflects multiple components. The largest primary source of energy is decarbonized electricity, but you can see that this blue line here, hydrogen, is an important part of knitting together these sectors. In addition to hydrogen used directly, in combination with CO2, we can form hydrocarbons. So these purple and blue lines both reflect hydrogen to a certain extent. So you can see that in this vision, hydrogen is a key underlying backbone of the solution. California has launched the renewable hydrogen sector, but now we need to consider how to scale it up and how to make it self-sustaining. California is an early adopter of fuel cell electric vehicles and committed $200 million in support to provide an initial network of refueling stations to provide adequate confidence to early adopters of fuel cell vehicles that they'll have convenient refueling. So we currently have 40 refueling stations, about 7,000 fuel cell vehicles, but we're expecting that to scale rapidly. California lacks a comprehensive cross-sectoral roadmap for the evolution of the renewable hydrogen ecosystem and the financial and policy support needed to successfully launch and scale the sector. So the topic question here is, what will it take in terms of cost, time, and policy to achieve a self-sustaining renewable hydrogen sector in California, by which we mostly mean it's cost competitive and can attract private finance. The roadmap effort looked at the requirements for a facility build-out from now through 2050 and assessed the costs and then policy and related support needed to achieve the build-out. The analysis is built up in several building blocks. The ultimate goal is to understand how many renewable hydrogen production facilities are needed, phased over time, of what type, where they should be located, and what policy, regulatory, and financial support is needed to achieve that. So the key building blocks of the analysis are, first, how will the cost of dispensed renewable hydrogen evolve over time? So that had three primary components feeding into it. The first was an assessment of the progression of renewable hydrogen production technologies, how they would evolve in cost and performance. Next, we assessed the cost and availability of feedstock going into those pathways. And finally, we assessed the costs of the supply chain after the plant gate to the point of end use to create an overall picture of the dispensed or delivered cost of renewable hydrogen. Next, we needed to assess the evolution of demand in order to understand the number of facilities that need to be built over time in order to serve the growth in demand in renewable hydrogen. Finally, we needed to conduct an assessment of where the facilities should be sited. And then with that picture of the requirements for the sectoral build-out and its costs, we could address the issue of policy, regulatory, and financial support needed to have a successful launch and scaling of the sector. So we considered a number of pathways for producing renewable hydrogen in this analysis. You can see here that there are quite a number of pathways that can be used for producing renewable gaseous fuel in the form of methane or hydrogen. Our focus here, of course, is hydrogen, but renewable biomethane can be reformed to hydrogen, and that's one of our primary pathways. So we considered three pathways. First is anaerobic digestion of wet organic material, which is then reformed to create hydrogen. Next, the direct thermochemical conversion of woody biomass to make hydrogen. And finally, water splitting via electrolysis using renewable energy as the third pathway for renewable hydrogen production. So just to jump forward to the bottom line, our conclusion is that the cost reduction technology for dispensed renewable hydrogen can be quite steep, and that in fact, within a roughly 5-year time horizon, we can achieve a point where renewable hydrogen is cost competitive on a fuel economy adjusted basis with conventional fuel. Over the long term, renewable hydrogen actually becomes less expensive on a fuel economy adjusted basis than conventional. By this time frame, however, we're competing not necessarily with conventional, but with battery electric drive as an alternative. At these cost levels, we expect that renewable hydrogen will be in the same cost range as renewable electricity in transportation. To build up this picture of delivered cost, we need to assess the costs of each component in the value chain, from the feedstock through conversion all the way through to dispensing. So we'll talk about that analysis here. So the technology forecast was primarily an extensive secondary research effort, and then augmented by some of our own analysis, particularly on learning curve forecasts. So the research that we consulted and what we conducted included a number of methods for forecasting. We did ourselves more than 40 interviews during the course of the work, but we also consulted a lot of other studies using expert elicitation, progress rate. The DOE's H2A tool uses bottom-up approach, and then we also can look at analogy or proxy. So for example, coal gasification provides some insights to biomass gasification. Then we normalized all the cost data to a common currency and a common time point. And we also addressed other factors in the analysis, such as scale. So different sources would report facility costs at different scales. We normalized them to a common scale. And for our build-out analysis, we established reference plant sizes that reflect minimum efficient scale for the different technologies. So here's a result of our research showing cost projections from a variety of research efforts. You can see that while there's a lot of scatter in the data, there's pretty much a uniform conclusion on what the cost progression, what the slope of cost reduction for electrolyzers can be. Electrolyzers have a very well correlated learning rate, so to the extent we can accurately forecast the growth in global market for electrolyzers, we can get an accurate picture on costs. So most of the difference in these forecasts relates to when they assumed the market would begin to launch and scale enough to create learning effect. One interesting thing to point out is that recent vendor quotes would indicate that we are tracking on the lower end of this range. So we performed similar analysis for all of the conversion technology pathways, and what you see here is the progression of capital cost across the different technologies. All of them are expected to show significant cost reduction. Electrolyzers have the highest learning rate among these different technologies, and so they show the most dramatic increase in cost, both because of the higher learning rate and because currently they're in the earlier stages of deployment, where the other technologies have a higher install base to start. The next component of the analysis is feedstock supply and cost. For the organic biomass feedstocks, we primarily used the Department of Energy billion ton study to determine the supply availability of biomass feedstock at various price points. We considered a price range for feedstock, or a recovery cost range, from $60 to $100 per dry ton. That yields a potential supply of 700 to 1,200 petajoules per year of raw biomass. We also forecast the cost of wind and solar as feedstock for electrolytic hydrogen production, and adopted a forecast that's in range of what you're hearing from most sources these days, which is wind and solar will track below 3 cents per kilowatt hour by the late 20s. So the overall result of the cost analysis is as you see here. So thermochemical conversion is initially the least expensive conversion pathway, including feedstock costs. However, electrolytic renewable hydrogen cost declines very rapidly as global installations of electrolyzers increase. And so by the mid-20s and forward, electrolyzers compete quite well on cost with thermochemical conversion, ultimately projecting to be perhaps a bit cheaper. Anaerobic digestion is a more expensive conversion technology, but as we'll talk about later, there are some policy mandates that will help offset this cost differential, such that the reformed biomethane pathways are on a net basis cost competitive with these others. So the next question is, what are the costs incurred from the plant gate through to the dispenser? There are two approaches used in the renewable hydrogen fuel supply chain in California: liquid hydrogen delivery and compressed gas delivery. So in one case, the renewable hydrogen from the production plant is compressed to high pressure. Sorry, I'm reversing that. So this is the liquid pathway. So in the first pathway, the produced hydrogen is liquefied in a liquefaction facility and then put in liquid hydrogen tankers, which then supply that hydrogen to the hydrogen refueling station, storing it on site in liquid form and dispensing it as needed. Next is the compressed hydrogen pathway. So in this case, the renewable hydrogen is compressed to high pressure, put into tube trailers, transported to the station, and stored on site in gaseous form. Our assessment of the cost for this part of the value chain was taken directly from a Department of Energy tool, the Hydrogen Delivery Analysis Model, HDSAM. The future supply chain may include other modes of transport, like pure hydrogen pipelines, at-station production, and new storage media such as liquid organic carriers and things of that nature. Those won't change the fundamental conclusions of the analysis because they'll be adopted to the extent that their economics are equal or better to what we're projecting with these current supply chains. So the cost progression of the X-plant supply chain is shown here. Interesting that the cost can come down by more than half very rapidly, and that's based only on utilization of the network. So by design, this initial network of hydrogen refueling stations is sparsely utilized and currently in the range of 30 to 40%. By 2025, we expect to see higher utilization, and that alone significantly improves the cost picture. So by 2025, we're projecting to around 70% or so utilization and eventually 80%. In addition to the utilization, station size increases somewhat over time. As each generation of new stations are installed, they're becoming larger. And so there's some benefit of scale economies, but also global growth in the number of stations deployed will lead to standardization of solutions and cost reduction of components in the supply chain. So with these components that we've assessed, the primary conversion costs, feedstock, and supply chain, we can take a look at how things stack up relative to the cost target that reflects fuel economy adjusted parity with conventional fuel. So you can see that in the current situation, the roughly $16, $17, even up to $20 cost level is quite outside the target range. However, by 2025, the lower end of the uncertainty bars are starting to come within range, so meaning that if the cost progression is on the optimistic end of what we expect, we'll start to see these production pathways coming into the target cost range. By 2030, many of them are within the target cost range at the midpoint of the projections. And this, at this stage, is without carbon credits. When those are applied, you'll see that we come well within the target range. So the next question here, as I mentioned, is the role of credits. There are both state and federal programs that assign effectively a carbon price into the fuel markets. So in California, it's called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Credit. You can see that the price has been rather volatile, but it's been trending up in recent times, up toward the $200 per credit cap, which is where it's trading today. At that level, as you'll see, renewable hydrogen can be very cost competitive. However, from a policy perspective, there's the investor risk of, well, you know, maybe the prices come back down here, we don't know. So that's one of the important policy issues to be addressed. The federal program applies to some, but not all hydrogen pathways. So another policy issue, to the extent this program continues, is to ensure that all of the renewable hydrogen pathways qualify. So to give a little quantitative flavor of the impact of credits, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Credit Program has a declining carbon cap, and basically fuels generate credits based on the difference between the carbon cap and the carbon intensity of a particular fuel. This chart shows the per kilogram impact on the cost of hydrogen at various carbon intensities. So if we consider renewable fuel to be zero carbon, you can see here that in the 2020 to 2030 timeframe, at $150 a credit, worth almost $4 per kilogram. The Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program is authorized through 2030. We've assumed, however, that it continues to 2050 and that it continues on a glide path necessary to achieve full decarbonization by 2050, which is the state's policy. So as that carbon cap declines, the number of credits generated by a zero carbon fuel reduce, and so by 2050, your LCFS value is much lower. And what that means is that the underlying technology costs need to progress in a way that they can make up for that difference. So quickly here, speaking of biomethane, there's a factor that comes into play there, which is not carbon credits, but it's tipping fees. California has mandates prohibiting the disposal of organic material in landfills, and it's a ratcheted standard. But by the late 20s, landfill disposal of organics will be completely prohibited, and so anaerobic digestion facilities become an effective disposal mechanism for that landfill diverted organic waste. And like landfills, we can expect those facilities to receive tipping fees from the parties, municipalities, and others disposing of the waste. That's currently the case, and we expect to see that continue. Those tipping fees effectively offset the higher cost of creating biomethane through anaerobic digestion. So if we look at the cost comparisons, including credits in $50 credit cost level and then a $150 per credit cost level, we can see that all these fuels are well within our target range by 2025 at a $150 credit value, and they're on the higher end of the range at a $50 LCFS credit level. One fact to point out is that dairy biomethane has a very low carbon intensity, so its net cost relative to alternatives depends a great deal on LCFS credit values. So this gets back to the slide I showed earlier, and sort of what's the foundation is the analysis we've just shown is what supports this cost progression forecast. And then to reiterate, we see this coming into the competitive range with conventional fuel by somewhere between 2023 and maybe, well, late 20s. depending on how costs project. So now we turn to the question of demand. There are 65 million metric tons of hydrogen produced and consumed annually worldwide. All of these current applications, which are dominated by petroleum refining and ammonia production, are candidates for renewable hydrogen demand in the future. In addition to these traditional sources of use for, or these traditional uses for hydrogen, new application areas come into play when we think about decarbonization strategies. So two primary additional applications that come into play are transportation and support of the electric grid. California has already launched its fuel cell electric vehicle program. The forecasts you see here were provided by the automakers. We currently have around 7,000 fuel cell electric vehicles in California. However, forecasts are that by 2030, we could have anywhere from 500,000 up to 1 million fuel cell electric vehicles, depending on adoption. So the light-duty fuel cell electric vehicles are on the top row you see here of the transportation demands, potentially for renewable hydrogen. But beyond the light-duty market, renewable hydrogen can be an effective solution for all modes of transportation, from local delivery, long-haul trucking, transit refuse. But in addition, even higher fuel demand, higher payload applications like marine, rail, and there's even work ongoing to use hydrogen for aviation. The electric grid is another future source of demand for renewable hydrogen. I won't go through the details of all these slides or all of these figures here, but what they represent is that as we move toward very high fractions of renewable energy, we'll need ways of providing firm backup for that through storage or effective storage. So daily, so day to night, this duck curve is becoming pretty well known, but it basically addresses the fact that solar is produced in the middle of the day, but it's not produced at night. Seasonally, we have a significant mismatch between supply and demand as well. So in January, in an average year, if we had this solar and wind portfolio sized to the average load, we'd be almost 50% below the demand in the low month. Beyond these predictable seasonal variations, there are occasional weather-related shortfalls in production that can lead to underproduction on the scale of a week. So hydrogen is a solution potentially that can address renewables firming at scales from intraday all the way up to seasonal. So here is one of our demand scenario results. This is in our high scenario. You can see in the 2050, the sort of the end state, transportation continues to be the largest source of demand, but we see by that point additional demand, substantial additional demand from heat and process applications, generation and storage, refining, and ammonia. If California moves to in-state production of more of its fertilizer, this ammonia wedge could in fact be quite a bit larger. Our analysis also didn't include potential export markets, so there could also be some additional demand if hydrogen-derived fuels were established as an export market in California. So ammonia would be a candidate for that type of thing. But as you can see here, by 2050, this scenario projects 4.2 billion kilograms of renewable hydrogen demand in the state by 2050. So that's a lot of new facilities required to serve that demand. So you can see that here. So if we assess what facility build out is required to serve that demand, you can see in this figure a scenario depicting that. So this figure shows the annual build of new facilities with these bars, with the colors reflecting the different technologies deployed in each particular year. The yellow curve reflects the aggregate growth in renewable hydrogen supply in the state. So we begin to see a ramp up in the late 20s. The build out accelerates substantially in the 2030s and 2040s and is effectively complete in the 2050 timeframe, driven in large part by the timing of our decarbonization mandates in California. So we'll need several hundred facilities to serve this load. That seems like a daunting construction challenge, and to some extent it is, but it's comparable to what we've seen in terms of build out in the wind and solar sectors. The cost will be in the range of 50 to 75 million, which also looks to be a rather large number, but for context, it's roughly equivalent to what we're spending in the petroleum fuel sector today. So before moving on to the question of where these facilities should be sited, I'll just briefly talk about the technology splits or market shares here. So for sake of time, I'll have to be pretty brief. But as we said earlier, the organic diversion mandates we expect will drive the development of conversion facilities for biomethane, and the tipping fees will be such that the cost differential can be neutralized for biomethane. So we see that coming in as a primary source of supply, but it's feedstock limited. So you see at the end of the day, it's not the largest source of supply. Electrolyzers and thermochemical systems will compete on cost, with the thermochemical systems being more cost effective early on. Later, as you've seen on the earlier charts, electrolyzers come down the cost curve and begin to compete on equal footing. And in the later part of the build out, supplies of biomass begin to be exhausted, and so electrolyzers become the primary new additions. So now we turn to the question of where these facilities should be sited, and I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit for the sake of time. But we established first areas that were unsuitable for building facilities, and then for each facility type, we established land requirements and infrastructure accessibility. And in all cases, proximity to feedstock is an important element of the siting analysis. So you can see that the different feedstocks are concentrated in different areas. In some cases, like thermochemical systems, proximity to feedstock is the dominant siting consideration, so that's where you'll see most of those facilities. The organic waste facilities, generally in urban areas, dairy biomethane projects, of course, in the San Joaquin Valley. And then electrolyzers could be sited either in proximity to the electric grid, if they're receiving grid electricity. We expect many of them will be co-located with wind and solar resources, so you'll see a lot of electrolyzer development in the wind and solar resource areas. Demand is another consideration. This is one depiction showing the demand concentrations for fuel cell electric vehicle fuel. This would be a good proxy for other sources of demand that are driven by economic activity, but then things like refining and ammonia production have their own siting characteristics, not shown here. So we had to look at various infrastructure layers in the GIS analysis. So grid-connected electrolyzers, obviously proximity to the electric grid is the dominant consideration. For grid support applications, we're assuming that the gas grid is used as the storage medium, so proximity to the gas grid is important for those. All of the systems need inbound and outbound logistics, so proximity to road or rail is important. In the analysis, we also considered air emissions, so these are the air basins and depicting the non-attainment and extreme non-attainment areas, and we also included local community impacts. So disadvantaged community impacts was one area that was interesting to address. We determined through the course of the analysis that more research is needed on this topic to better understand how these communities themselves would weigh positive impacts like green job creation against negative impacts such as local air emissions, noise, visual impact, and traffic. So what we arrived at doing here, again noting the need for further research, is we prohibited placement of facilities that create NOx or PM in non-attainment areas and in disadvantaged communities. So here's a representative illustration of one of the spatial build-out scenarios, and as you can see, and consistent with that build-out S-curve we showed, 2025, we have a couple of dozen facilities of various types, but a lot of it is reformed biomethane. Later, going through 2030, we start to get more facilities, but also more representation of electrolytic and thermochemical, continuing in 2040. And by 2050, you now see that electrolyzers and thermochemical facilities are the primary sources of supply. So this kind of completes the picture of what does the cost evolution look like in the sector, what quantity of facilities need to be built? Where will they go? So we now turn to the last question, which is what sorts of policy support are needed to help all this happen? So the first, which was mentioned earlier on, the state does not currently have, quote, a renewable hydrogen strategy. The state's primary planning vehicle for its decarbonization strategies is called the AB32 Scoping Plan. So it's important that in the next iteration of that plan, hydrogen is specifically reflected on a cross-sectoral basis so that we can drive policies in an integrated way. Next, we need to expand policies and programs within the hydrogen sector to the entire value chain. The early focus has been on hydrogen refueling stations, which is appropriate given that light-duty vehicles are the anchor of this new source of demand, and we need some fueling stations to provide confidence to drivers. But as the sector begins to scale and we bring in new applications, more vehicles, and get, include heavy duty in these things, we need to place more focus on the remainder of the value chain and on the production end in particular. We need to design programs and incentives in ways that help attract private capital down the road. So examples of those type of program features would be loan guarantees as opposed to grants, for example. So loan guarantee programs typically require the same type of diligence that a commercial lender would require, so they can be supportive of commercial financing of next generation of projects. Revenue certainty is one of the biggest issues for anybody looking to invest in a renewable hydrogen production facility. So legislation has been proposed to establish a price floor on the low carbon fuel standards, so things like that can be very supportive. An early market like this typically, as you would imagine, doesn't have a great number of participants, and there's quite a bit of vertical integration. So the state can indirectly help attract new entrants by, for example, giving preference to new entrants as it scores projects that are receiving any kind of state support. We need to develop a stronger fact base, as we've discussed, on local community impacts of renewable hydrogen facilities and how those communities themselves would see those trade-offs. And lastly, we need to continue support for R&D focused largely on cost reduction. We also need to fund commercial projects that help create a operating history and performance reference base to support financing of projects in the future. So that concludes what I have to present to you today. Thank you again very much for the opportunity to speak here, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.